What do boy bands, rollerblades, and bass lures all have in common? Their popularity hinges on trendiness. They can fly off the shelves for years, then suddenly become completely uncool. Take the as seen on TV banjo minnow as an example. If you grew up in the 90s, you probably had a set, but did they really catch you more bass than the staples already in your tackle box? Ultimately, a lure's worth should only be measured by its ability to catch fish. That's why some bass lures never really go out of style, though you might not be fishing those lures because they're no longer on trend. So today, we're going to find out why what's considered old is actually new again, at least as far as the bass in your home waters are concerned, and which baits you should be pulling out of the pasture and putting on deck. I'm Outdoor Life Fishing Editor Joe Cermele, and this is the Quick Strike Podcast. Today, I'm talking to Chris Bohlman, a buddy of mine and the Florida-based host of the YouTube channel Retro Bassin. Now, to put this bluntly, Chris is just completely ate up with bass tackle from the 80s and 90s, and not just from a collecting perspective. The motivation for his channel stems from pure nostalgia and just a longing for the days when we didn't have 5,000 worm choices in tackle shops, and bass fishing was simpler and arguably more affordable than it is today. The overriding message of a lot of his content is that you don't need a $500 rod, forward-facing sonar, and hard-to-get baits from Japan to be successful and enjoy a day of bass fishing. Now, Chris is so devoted to what he does that he genuinely fishes with nothing but this vintage gear, including his boat, which is retro and outfitted entirely with electronics from the 80s and early 90s. So the bottom line is that Chris puts his money where his mouth is, right? He's not suggesting you use a lure that's taken a back seat to more modern offerings because he remembers what he used to catch on it. He's still out fishing this stuff today. So let's find out which bass killers he thinks you're overlooking, how to fish some in surprising ways, and why a lure that's so 30 years ago might actually catch you more and bigger fish than all of the new cool stuff in your box. So, Chris, in your own words, man, tell us a little bit about what attracts you to this vintage tackle, why you do what you do, why you are so passionate about lures and tackle in general from the 80s and 90s.
Great question, Joe. Well, I think the first thing is you definitely do collect what you remember. And for me, sort of my glory days of bass fishing, it was, those 1988, 1989, 1990 Bass Pro Shops Master Catalog years, where you would wait to see who won the Bassmaster Classic and pretty much base a whole lure order around that. Back in the day when you used to wake up on a Saturday and Sunday and spend your mornings with Jimmy Houston and Roland Martin and Hank Parker and, of course, Bill Dance. And so for me, that's kind of where it started. I know that, collecting goes way, way back, right? We're talking about some of the old, the Heddens, and the Creek Chubs and the Flugers. But for me, my wheelhouse, and I think a little bit probably like your wheelhouse, is that sort of 1980s and 90s era of bass fishing.
Sure. And I mean, I still fish a lot of stuff that I grew up fishing too. But I mean, you've developed an entire YouTube channel around your passion for this, Retro Bassin. And I mean, you're even fishing on a boat that is outfitted with vintage 80s and 90s electronics. I mean, you've gone to the nth degree here, Chris.
Yeah, and we've been pretty much unwavering in the mission. It's interesting, but when I started the YouTube channel, there was a lot of YouTube fishing channels popping up. I think all the Googans were about 12 or 13 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start a channel. And I, kind of didn't want to go the same route of kind of chasing that most recent modern lure, doing a tackle review or rod and reel review on something that's just came out. I spent enough money at Tackle Warehouse. Frankly, I didn't need to make that worse. So I kind of went the other direction. And it was really going all old school, or at least old school as according to me, because obviously it's a little bit of a moving target as to how old you are.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah, this certainly speaks to people. I mean, I'm 41 now. This speaks to people in my age bracket for sure. But I mean, you just hit on a good point, that everybody now is always clamoring on YouTube in particular to sort of show you the latest and greatest and sort of, be the first one to market with the coolest new thing out of Japan or the coolest new category of lure or whatever it may be. So would you agree? I mean, would you say that, especially with the younger generation of anglers, it is sort of a deal now where a lot of lures that are still very productive and have been for a very long time, just based purely on popularity's sake. Like, in other words, these aren't the cool things to throw anymore because there are so many options out there now. Are taking a back seat to some of this modern tackle, some things we should not be forgetting about, no matter how old you are or where you bass fish.
I think bass fishermen have some of the shortest term memories of any sportsman out there. It's amazing. And quite frankly, it's even funny to see articles and videos about, things that came out, even less than a year ago that are now obsolete.
Right.
And I think that's one of the tricks with bass fishing. And one of the risks is that if you're always chasing the new thing's never cheaper than the old thing. That's kind of the way it works out.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think bass fishing at its core, when you and I were kiddos, probably trespassing around, fishing, rivers and lakes.
Not
and
me.
You
speak for yourself. I never would do anything like that. That's ludicrous. Absolutely not me.
Oh, we even do like the proper times to go to not get kicked out. But it was an accessible sport. You didn't need, $20,000 of electronics. And you didn't need, to have a 6-figure income to go out there and catch those little green fish.
Sure.
And I think for me, that's a little bit about what retro Bassin is kind of getting back to those simpler times, which in a lot of ways means picking up lures that maybe have been forgotten by time.
So let's talk about some that have been forgotten by time. I mean, I certainly can throw a few on that list that I think are very overlooked these days, but you're the king of this, man. I mean, what you do is review and chronicle and devote so much time and effort into keeping some of this older tackle in the spotlight. So hit me, man. Give me your first one that you would say like not enough people are fishing anymore.
Well, this one kind of came from a conversation you and I had recently, and in my hand I am holding an old school Fred Arbogast jitterbug.
Yeah, that's the first one that would have made my list. So I'm glad you hit that one. Yeah.
You've mentioned it several times, and I had to dig one out of the old collection. This is a bait that is still available today, but I don't know that most people realize just how old the jitterbug is. Mm-hmm. So there was a dance that came out in the 1930s by the same name.
Yeah.
And this lure followed. I think it was first developed in around 1933. I think it was eventually sold for the first time in 1939 as an old wooden bait.
Yeah.
And for those who've never seen a jitterbug or fished one, it's a sort of a bean-shaped body. It's about 2.5 inches, 3 inches long. But the whole action is this metal lip in the front, which you don't have to impart any action into this bait. You just chunk and wind it, which is what's so brilliant about it.
Yeah, and then what happened? It's a heart-shaped metal lip, very unique, and I know a little bit of the history of the jitterbug. I mean, it was so revolutionary at the time. Nothing else had been developed like that. And basically, what's happening as you steadily reel that bait is one side of that lip touches the water, and then it waddles on the other side, and it happens so fast with such a high vibration, it makes a gurgling sound, unlike any other topwater. Now, today, I mean, what is that spawn, Chris? The crawler category of lures, I guess they call them now. I mean, there are many baits that have riffed off this from, bat lures. I mean, there was a lure that there was a bat where the wings slapped the water as it crawled. But all these modern versions of these style of baits are all ultimately paying homage to Arbogast jitterbug. And it's a favorite of mine, particularly at night, right? One of the most fun things to do in the summer is throw a jitterbug in the dark because all you can do is hear it. There's no visual cue. So you hear that gurgling, and when it stops or gets hammered, you know what's up. And I wonder when like the last time a jitterbug was thrown in a professional bass tournament. Who knows? I bet it's been decades, unless you know something I don't, Chris.
You would be laughed off the Guggen squad so quickly if you actually broke out a jitterbug in a professional tournament. And I don't know that they necessarily work with forward-facing sonar either, so that's probably a little bit of an issue. But
no.
But it's an interesting bait, and it went through a few changes. So it started out wood and metal, like so many baits of that era. Yeah. But because it continued on, it changed. And I think the first time they went to plastic was in 1958. They stopped making the wood, started going to plastic. And then in 78 was one of my favorite sort of versions of the jitterbug, and that was the Seeing's Believe in line. I don't know if you've ever seen the jitterbugs that either look like a red-winged blackbird or a chipmunk or a mouse, but they had this really amazing naturalistic displays. And at that point, I think Fred Arbogast himself had long since sold the company and passed, but that was a really unique, supernatural looking jitterbug. Sort of the opposite of the old nighttime, old school black jitterbug, which of course is the classic for the evening.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm throwing a jitterbug, it's black 95% of the time, all black, which is funny because, I mean, even if you look at lure colors and in terms of how they sort of feed into popularity, I mean, for most people, a black lure, that's very boring. That's not eye-catching on the tackle shop shelves. So I remember a few years ago, the Arbogast company actually put out a Jitterbug 2.0, and they had all these skull patterns and all these wacky, different color patterns. And I mean, really, that was to hopefully make them look more modern and attract the next generation of bass fishermen to them. I don't really think that worked. I don't think that really re-energized popularity or a new group of anglers to buy the Jitterbug. But I mean, that has quietly been sitting on shop shelves since it came out. They catch smallmouth, they catch, I've even caught some trout on jitterbugs at night. And they are an incredibly effective lure. They have smaller hooks, I think, than what most people want on a bass lure now, but they've always worked. I've never had a problem with them, you know what I mean? So they just are so unassuming compared to all this modern crawler stuff, but the jitterbug is absolutely a classic. So there's one top water. What else? What else are we not fishing enough, Chris?
So, by the way, and I did just think of something before we move on from the jitterbug. So probably the most famous jitterbug catch that I know of was made by a young angler who wasn't yet a professional by the name of Bill Dance.
Oh, really?
And this was the first ever lure Bill Dance used to catch a largemouth bass. He had a great story about he was just a young kid growing up, and he saw this in the window or on the shelf of a local tackle shop, $5, saved up his money, and he went out and caught his first ever largemouth bass on a jitterbug that probably looked just like this.
There you go.
So the pros do use them. So speaking of other icons, growing up to me, in preparation for this little call here, I was looking at some of the old Bass Pro Shops catalogs, and I was perusing the 1988 Master Catalog.
It's incredible you still have these things. Good for you. Yeah.
Oh, I do. They're getting worn out because I actually use them.
Right.
And I did one time try to call Bass Pro and order something out of there. They don't usually stock stuff. So I tried. It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
But 12 of the first pages in the lures, including the first lure in there after the tackle boxes, they were spinnerbaits. They had 12 straight pages of spinnerbaits from Bass Pro Shops, Strike King, Blue Fox, Bumblebee. I mean, all these different companies. And it's a wild that when you think about just how much that was the dominant bass lure in the late 80s. So wild.
Yes. And well, it's funny too. I'm glad you brought up spinnerbaits because they definitely deserve that. I would totally agree they are overlooked, and I have a little idea of why. But to your point, yes, like even if you didn't go to a Bass Pro Shops, if you went to a Kmart back in the day, I mean, the selection of spinnerbaits, and there weren't a ton of expensive ones. Nowadays, I believe it was Terminator lures that came out with the first one that people were like, oh my God, this is way too expensive for a spinnerbait.
$10. Whoa.
$10 for $9.99. I mean, they had premium components, and it was sort of this shift. And the first time everybody went, man, that's crazy. Because as a kid, what was also great about spinnerbaits, you could buy the brand names, you could buy the Strike King or whatever it may be in the nice bubble package. But every store just also would have these no-name brands that just hung on the pegs with no packaging. I mean, and they'd be white or chartreuse, and you just and they were super cheap. I mean, $2-3 max. You didn't really know who made them. There was no logo or anything on the blades. But I mean, to that end, they were an affordable lure that caught bass everywhere, which they still do. Now, I interpret the sort of the downfall of the spinnerbait to the rise in popularity of the chatterbait. And it seems to me like nowadays that is the in version of the old school spinnerbait. It has the chattering lip on the front that makes more vibration. It's designed a little bit differently, but I would definitely agree that that's fallen off. Why do you see the correlation between modern chatterbaits? Why do you think they've fallen out of popular favor?
So I think 100% the death knell of the spinnerbait was that first chatter of the chatterbait. I absolutely think that's what did it. And it's wild because I like a chatterbait, but I'm personally much more versatile and much more confident with a spinnerbait. I can do more with it. I can, wake it on top. I can slow roll it. Two things I don't do with a chatterbait. I can definitely flip a spinnerbait, and it's funny, but one of my confidence baits, even to this day, is a spinnerbait. But I think if you're just, old school chunking and winding it, maybe that's where a chatterbait would excel. But for me, I think there's so many things you can do with a spinnerbait. And in particular, some of the spinnerbaits that have been forgotten, that classic single Colorado blade spinnerbait.
Right.
That you don't see a whole lot anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that was one. I think the skirts changing. So they had, all the skirts used to be made out of latex. And they called them two different things. But there was the latex tube skirt. And then there was the latex skirt that was sort of in the shape of little, each filament of it was a little bit more circular or square. And those were the living rubber skirts.
Right, yeah.
Those skirts look so good in the water. If you take a latex living rubber skirt, cast that out, the whole thing undulates like a jellyfish when you're reeling it in. It looks nothing like any of the modern skirts. And I think my favorite spinnerbait skirts were that. The problem is living rubber doesn't live too long.
Right.
And when it dies, it junks up, it mucks up, and there's nothing you can do. And I think that was a little bit of what happened too.
I'm sure plenty of people listening can think back on like opening that tackle box in August that maybe you haven't opened in a while, and those skirts would just sort of melt and merge together. And I mean, you could replace them. They always sold replacement skirts for spinnerbaits, but how many people actually did that? But again, the nice thing was that you could sort of just chuck them or replace them if you wanted to, and you could go buy some new ones for a couple of bucks. So I mean, I've also noticed that kind of skirting material that was so popular is sort of fading away. It's been a long time, Chris, since I've bought a brand new spinnerbait out of the package nowadays. What's different? Like, what are they using for skirting material now?
Well, so it's interesting, but a lot of the skirts were made by a place called Bacon's Tackle in Shreveport, Louisiana. And I was out there doing a show, and Michael Bacon, the owner, said that Jimmy Houston had just been by recently investigating skirts. And I think a few years later, he came back out with the Red Man spinnerbait from Lucky Strike Lures. And I actually just picked up some of those. It is a single Colorado spinnerbait with a living rubber skirt. It's about as old school, simple as it gets.
Yeah.
And it's a great looking bait.
Yeah.
So I think they are still coming out with those. Another really well-known spinnerbait guy from back in the day, Hank Parker, who won a Bassmaster Classic on, I think then was a man's spinnerbait. It was a double Colorado.
Sure.
He just came out with a version of, he calls it the classic spinnerbait on his website. So it's kind of nice to see these old school bass icons start re-releasing the baits that made them famous. And, it's interesting that Jimmy Houston and Hank Parker both have old school spinnerbaits you can buy right now.
Yeah. Well, you'd said something earlier that I want to hit on again. People think of spinnerbaits like many lures as a cast and retrieve lure. I cast this out, I let it sink to depth, I reel it back, it gets hammered on the way in. And certainly you catch a lot of fish just straight reeling a spinnerbait, like you say. But I don't think people recognize the versatility of a lure like that the way the old school guys did. I mean, you can jig a spinnerbait straight up and down off the bottom. I know it can get hit on the drop because as they fall, those blades go almost straight vertical and spin like a helicopter as they fall. Do you think that the sort of the idea that people don't know how versatile they are is also hurting them?
Well, and maybe if you think about this, it's kind of funny. We led with the jitterbug. But you almost wonder if chatterbait is sort of the spinnerbait version of a jitterbug, where the action is in the lip, it's built in.
Right.
And a classic spinnerbait, you got to kind of work it.
Yeah.
There was an old VHS video I saw of a young KVD talking about spinnerbaits. And the way he was fishing them is he said he would not reel that spinnerbait a couple feet without twitching it or jerking it or pulsing it.
Sure.
And ever since I watched that video, that's the way that I don't ever just cast and reel that thing in. I'm always jerking it, twitching it, pausing it. And I think that's where most of my strikes come from.
There you go. So a little bit more finesse to a classic spinnerbait might turn some more people back onto a lure that's sort of fading away. What's next, man? What's on the list?
All right. So Desert Island, you've got like one lure to catch any kind of species of fish. To me, it is a casting spoon.
Aha.
I don't mean a jigging spoon. I don't mean one of the big Nichols, 3 foot long spoons for deep water, that kind of stuff. No,
yeah.
Like a classic, either weedless, like a Johnson Silver Minnow.
Sure.
Or non-weedless, like a Epping or Daredevil 2/5 ounce imp spoon. Just something that you can go out there, cast it, and reel it, depending. And man, I there's not a fish that I've ever gone after that did not eat a silver spoon.
I think it is so funny you brought up like a desert island scenario, because I've written some things in the past, back in World War II, I believe it was, they started putting white bucktail jigs in the ditch bags of airmen, right? And the plain old white bucktail jig, no doubt, is one of the most versatile fish catching lures ever made. It will catch any fish, any predator fish that swims salt and fresh water. But I always thought to myself, if you wound up stranded on some atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and you had your white bucktail and the first cast on a hand line or whatever you cobbled together went out there and a barracuda came along, now you just have a jig head with no hair left on it. So I always thought... If you're lucky. So I always thought that a metal casting spoon would have been the smart... I mean, I have Hopkins lures and Johnson Silver Minnows that, I mean, they are so tarnished and so scraped up, but as long as they just have that little bit of flash, and you can always polish them, you can always refurbish them, metal is metal, they are much more versatile. So talk to me about the Johnson Silver Minnow in particular, because, I mean, that is just an incredibly classic lure in salt and freshwater. I know that there are redfish and sea trout guys that still lean very heavily into the Johnson Silver Minnow, but I would agree that has fallen off in the bass world. And I always thought what was cool about these spoons is that they have, the one single hook that's weedless, which also allows you to spice them up with a variety of soft plastics. So are you a trailer man, or when you throw those for bass, is it just sort of plain Jane, right out of the package?
Man, I am 50-50. And I think the first time I saw a pro use a silver minnow was Roland Martin. He actually had a whole kit where he had a couple spinnerbaits, not surprisingly, and a Johnson Silver Minnow. He was sponsored by them for a brief time.
Yeah.
And it's funny, but I got here to Florida, and it's a bait that locals still fish. They don't talk about it a ton.
Right.
But they still throw a silver minnow. They still throw a black silver minnow. It's an interesting spin on it.
Really?
So there's the gold, there's the silver. The black, it's still metallic,
right?
But it's kind of muted. And my buddy Ted Lincoln over in Gainesville kind of turned me on to those. And where those really excel are days where it's a little bit overcast. You don't want to scare the fish too much. The fish are a little bit spooky, perhaps. The black flashes, but not with that sort of intensity of a silver or a gold blade.
Sure.
So a black one. Redfish, by the way, also go for a black silver minnow.
I've caught tons of redfish on silver minnows. And what I've also seen guys do too is, again, it's funny. The common theme with some of these lures you're bringing up is that people have this notion that they are meant to be cast and reeled back. But like something like a silver minnow, especially if it's tipped with a soft plastic trailer, it's been a long time since I've seen this, but I have seen guys on bass boats where I live, sort of work the pads, and there'll be a hole in the pads, and they'll just flip that spoon to the hole in the pads, and that thing just wobbles. They don't do anything. It just wobbles down as it falls, and the trailer is kicking away, and it's sort of like a version of flipping, like flipping heavier jigs, but you're doing it with this light spoon that just waddles down, and wham! I mean, as it drops, they just hit that hole, bring it in, flick it to the next hole, drops and waddles in. It's a very forgotten bass lure.
And one of the best shallow water lures out there. I'm glad you mentioned flipping and pitching. I totally would go down the bank, depending. Now, where there's weeds, I'm going silver minnow. Mm-hmm. Where there's not weeds, I'm probably going daredevil.
Okay.
But either way, both those lures, you can flip them up into 6 inches of water and work them all the way down to 4 feet, depending. That's what's so cool about the versatility of those baits. If you don't just cast and reel it, but if you twitch it, if you pause it, You can work it on top. You can let it sink down. And man, to me, yeah, when I am on my spoon game, when you're kind of casting, you've got that good cadence going, it's hard to cast without thinking that something's going to come out and just chew that thing up.
Yeah. I could not agree with those three picks more, but I know. So you got a little sneaky in lieu of another bait. You want to talk about a color that is sort of fallen by the wayside, and I have no idea where you're going with this one, but I am excited to hear about a color that's old school that we're overlooking now.
Well, so I was doing some reading last night, and so this is a book by Mr. Bill Dance called There He Is. And by the way, so There He Is, when Bill was fishing.
That's a great book title for...
oh, what a great book title.
Yeah, I mean, you hear so many YouTubers that catch a fish and go, there he is, there he is.
There he is. And when he would say that, the cameraman would know, hey, he's about to set the hook on a fish. And maybe he says it twice. But it's a book on, Bill Dance's book on the art of worm fishing. And the cover is just a rainbow of colors. Look at this. There are blues and reds and yellows and oranges and greens and clears. And then you compare this to, let's say you go on, Tackle Warehouse and look, and every lure is basically a variation of a green pumpkin or black body.
You're not wrong. Yeah.
And those work. I don't doubt that those work, but I think for me, a little bit of the lure of fishing with old lures is the fact that if you throw something like a jitterbug, like a spoon, like a spinnerbait, like maybe a clear yellow worm, it's something that bass have not seen.
Yes.
When you look at the lifespan of bass, you look at how old these plastics are. I can be pretty well be assured if I found one of these baits and threw it, there's not a bass alive that's ever seen one. So there are some wild colors out there that we don't fish.
You bring up a great point. I mean, my uncle growing up, his color was methiolate, which is sort of orangey, bubblegum pink. And that still has some play, I think, in saltwater circles for sea trout and things like that. But I mean, man, I can't remember the last time I saw a guy at the local pond flicking an 8-inch, bubblegum pink worm around. And yes, I mean, look, we are about naturals. Everything is green pumpkin, red flake, everything, the blacks and the browns. And I get that. But you make a good point, right? If you sort of think outside the box and are willing to go back to some of these maybe less natural, more flashy, just different colors that guys like Bill Dance and Hank Parker were throwing years ago, I mean, everything goes in a cycle. So, I mean, over the last 10 years, what are your bass seeing? Black, green pumpkin, over and over and over again. And sometimes just grabbing something that's blue or, like you said, a clear yellow. I haven't seen that clear yellow in so long. These things that we think are tired, that had their time, they are done. Well, they've probably never been seen by a lot of the fish in your lake. You are giving them something old and therefore showing them something new. And there's a lot to be said for that in terms of success.
Well, and I think one of the colors you mentioned was blue. So blue's one that I throw a pretty good bit. In fact, the first bass ever caught in a BASS tournament was caught on a blue worm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it was caught on a blue worm and a blue flip-tail worm by Bill Dance, actually, and it was caught within the first 3 minutes of the first BASS event. But since then, I've been throwing a ton of those baits. It's also interesting when you think about fish vision. So I did a recent episode on the history of chartreuse, and I kind of started to look at some of the biology of the way fish see. So bass are dichromatic, which means they have two cones, unlike you and me, which have three. And they see reds and greens really well. But when it comes to yellows and whites, they actually confuse those two. And when it comes to black and blues, they confuse those two. To the point that a chartreuse probably looks white to them, and a blue probably looks black. So it's interesting when you think about the way fish are and what they can see, but they can see reds really well. They can see greens really well, which is probably where we get all that green pumpkin action. We don't throw a ton of red, and I wonder why.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I got to say, man, I think you've definitely educated us on some things to think about here. And also, I would argue they could save you money. I mean, if you are an angler on a budget, I mean, Johnson's Silver Minnows and some War Eagle spinnerbaits or whatever's still out there, the Strike Kings, this stuff will cost you in the long run a lot less to stock your tackle box with some of these things than some of the most modern things. And I don't know, man. I'm going out to buy some blue worms right now.
If you can find them, good luck.
I'll throw two more lures in the mix for your consideration. Okay, the first being the Arbogast hula popper. Now, in all black, the smaller models in particular do a great job of mimicking cicadas or a big juicy beetle that fell in the water, and they are one of my all-time favorite topwaters to throw for summer smallmouths. Then, don't sleep on the beetle spin. These tiny spinner baits have been around forever. Not quite as long as the hula popper, but a long time. You can still buy one for about $2, and as goofy and stiff as they look with their little soft plastic grub trailer, man, I have caught some giant largemouths on these little fellas, not to mention big summer crappies and pickerel too. So for more great tricks, tips, and history lessons on 80s and 90s era bass tackle, subscribe to the Retro Bassin YouTube channel, okay? And the next time you're lure shopping, ask yourself if you want to be the cool kid because you have the trendiest lures or because you catch more fish. You can also find Chris on Instagram at Retro Bassin. Now, if you've got a topic you'd like to hear covered, let me know. Send an email to quickstrikepodcast@gmail.com or find me on Instagram at Joe Cermele138. If you want to hear more from me, join me on my weekly long-form podcast, Cut and Retie, every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.